Dylan Burroughs, a best-selling author, once said, "Let us live not only to serve God ourselves, let us live to help our children and their children live for God." Isn't that what our legacy as Catholics should be? Living to serve God, to honor and glorify Him, but to also set a positive example for future generations? That is our baptismal call. I was raised in a family whose love for God and passion for our Catholic faith were evident and contagious. Originally named Blessed Sacrament Parish, charter families of Holy Name included my great-grandparents, grandparents, and a few great-aunts and great-uncles. My great-aunt, Mary Elizabeth Gertrude, was the first to be baptized on August 7, 1908. My grandma, Bertha von der Sar Kuntz, was the youngest of 7. When her mother, Louisa, was pregnant with her, her father fell from a truck, injured his head, and died. Great-Grandma Louisa then was left to raise these 7 young children on her own. It is not surprising, then, that Grandma was raised to be a very hard worker, contributing to the family farm and housework on the property that is now known as home to the Altenheim. Diligent, extroverted, and somewhat stoic, Grandma was known for her careful prayer life, love of sports, love of competition, and affinity for gardening and nature. Grandma's mother, Louisa, was a charter member of Holy Name, as were 5 of her children and her daughter-in-law. My grandpa was William Anthony Kuntz. He was born and raised in Shirley, Indiana, not too far from here. Though his parents gave birth to 10 children, only 6 survived beyond their first year, and one of those 6 passed away at the age of 19. This left Grandpa to be the oldest surviving child, even though he was number 3 on the family tree. When he was a teenager, his family moved to Beech Grove. Grandpa befriended Father Killian and traveled with him, assisting him with his missions. He also served in a choir of 2 while his sister played the organ. Unfortunately, Mr. Craney would have attested that none of their musical ability was passed down to our generation. It is believed that Grandpa discerned priestly life, for he was actively engaged in the church. Grandpa was introspective, quiet, prayerful, and devout to his faith and his family. This photo shows Monsignor Killian on the 39th anniversary of his ordination. To his right are Grandpa Kuntz, our oldest uncle, my daddy, and our cousin Johnny Birch. According to church records, my grandparents celebrated the first Catholic marriage at Blessed Sacrament, which took place on April 27, 1910. This is the same year that the first electric lights in Beech Grove were installed, in the rectory no less. It was a little before the time of Will Bain, Mike Lamping, and Tom Kidwell renovating the current rectory. It was 8 years later that our parish took the new name of Holy Name of Jesus Catholic Church. Grandma and Grandpa lived in a gray house off of Hobart and Southern Avenue, just blocks from an aunt and her family to one side and an uncle and his family to the other. Grandpa was a clerk for the railroad in the Big 4 shops, which had been built in 1905. He and Grandma raised their family of 8, tended to their garden, and remained actively engaged in church life at Holy Name. When they weren't working from sunrise to sundown, Grandma was often on the edge of her seat watching a sporting event of one sort or another, and Grandpa could be found reading the Bible or another piece of literature. One favorite pastime for Grandma was watching my daddy when he played football for Butler University, as shown in this photo. The youngest of Bertha and William's children was William Francis Kuntz, who became the greatest man I ever knew. My daddy. And he just happened to fall in love with the most wonderful woman I ever knew, whom I had the honor of calling Mommy. Though my mother's parents were Christian, they were not Catholic. My mom, Florence Elma Hansing, and her sister joined the Catholic Church on their own and with great conviction. Mom was only 9 or 10 years old when she first inquired about this faith she came to embrace. Shortly after, she was baptized and began attending St. Roch Catholic Church. Dad and Mom, both born in 1928, were married on March 31st, 1951, and over the course of the following 20 years became the proud parents of 11 children, 9 of whom survived beyond infancy. They purchased the gray house from my grandparents, who then moved to a brick home on Main Street. By the time the baby was born, that would be me, Dad and his buddies built the red brick home on the corner, right next to the gray house that remained in our family through 2010. Even now, family of family lives there. Dad was a teacher, coach, and principal at both Arlington High School and Cecina Memorial before serving as executive director of the Catholic Youth Organization for over 25 years. Mom was a full-time domestic engineer and mother extraordinaire. Together, they illustrated the beauty and joy of a marriage centered on God and the gift of service. My favorite memories illustrate the emphasis of faith and family in our lives. You may relate to several of these. For example, at times I would line my baby dolls on the interior steps of our home to drive them to church and then hold Mass in the living room with smashed bread and Kool-Aid. I played school in the basement, or when I was able to tag along with Dad as he visited athletic events, I would camp out in any classroom I could find and write on every chalkboard. I loved traveling with Dad to drop off items at CYO camp or to work with him at the office. Every adventure included some discussion about Jesus and our faith, and often included the rosary. And of course, I could count on some type of practical joke and lots of laughter. I also enjoyed watching my mom whip up any one of her masterpieces in the kitchen. Homemade cherry pie, perfectly formed meatballs, and the best chicken Kiev I've ever had. Mom used her baking skills to contribute goods to mercy meals and church dinners. She also sewed costumes for several musicals, style shows, and school productions. It was not uncommon to go with Dad to visit the Franciscan sisters at Oldenburg or to tool along beside him when he met with seminarians at St. Meinrad. I remember a special breakfast at the home of then Archbishop Edward T. O'Mara, and a time when the Archbishop came by to visit my dad before he passed away. It just so happened a friend was picking me up for volleyball practice that evening, and her little sister jumped in the car to exclaim to her father that the Pope was at my house. Priests would come over for cookouts occasionally, and sometimes even a dip in the pool. What a tremendous blessing it was for my siblings and me to see the joy, goodness, and love of these deeply committed Catholics who chose religious life for our benefit and through God's grace. And oh, how my parents would have loved this guy, Father Bob Robeson, just as we all do. There was never a meal shared until we said the blessing prayer, which always ended with all for the honor and glory of God. Though both of our parents are surely in heaven, this addition to the prayer remains strong in our family. Dad attended Mass practically every day, and both he and Mom encouraged our participation in choir and service around the school and church grounds. From the time my older brother Joe was able to see over the steering wheel of the big tractor, he was expected to drive down to Raymond Street and mow Monsignor Downing Field for CYO events. Our parents taught us what tithing was, and even when we had the paper route at St. Francis Hospital, we were expected to set aside 10% for the church. I must admit that sometimes my envelope may have been missing a few quarters. Mom and Dad ensured that all 9 of us had the opportunity to experience quality Catholic education right here at Holy Name. While they were certainly our first teachers of the faith, my personal experience at Holy Name, Roncalli, and Marian College shaped who I became as a Christian, wife, mother, and teacher. How many of you knew Jill McCormick? She was one of my favorite teachers before I even stepped foot in her classroom. She taught my older brother Joe at Holy Name and was a Cecina grad who knew my dad from their shared days there. She would send clay, records, and jump ropes home over the summer for me to use and play school in my basement and on our back porch. When I finally got to be a giant myself, I couldn't wait to have her as my very own teacher. I remember hanging on every word as she taught us about the sacraments. To this day, I try to keep my elbows off the pew because, as Mrs. McCormick said, God doesn't want to see dirty elbows. Mrs. McCormick passed away just months ago and had kept notes of gratitude from students from the decades that she served. Here is one such note written by my nephew Danny after his first communion. It all came full circle when I was then privileged enough to serve as principal here at Holy Name for 6 years. I got to serve beside Jill McCormick and Jerry Craney, who had both taught me. I was surrounded with some of the most amazing, dedicated teachers and staff one school could have. To see firsthand the commitment of these outstanding professionals, these missionary disciples, and the depth of their love for Christ and our faith made me a much better person and has truly aided in the transformation of lives of children and families we have served. Here is a note of gratitude from a student teacher, Katie Kennedy, who later married and is now known as Katie Allen and became a teacher at Holy Name. The sacraments of baptism, first reconciliation, confirmation, and marriage were all celebrated here. Some of the most important events in my life, all right here. I am immensely blessed to have been raised by 2 incredible parents, along with 8 amazing siblings and their spouses, and then to marry Scott Fleming, this wonderful Christian man who with integrity, kindness, love, and commitment to faith is our rock. I am more blessed than I deserve. A little side note here. Scott is not Catholic, but before we were married, he made a commitment to raise our children in the Catholic faith. He has done so marvelously, attending Mass with us every Sunday, investing in our parish and the Catholic education of our children and a few others, and contributing to the Catholic community at large through service and through his role as Marian University's head softball coach. Go Knights! So Scott, Drew, Noah, and I agree that this place is a very significant part of our heritage. It is no wonder that my siblings and their families, along with my little family of 4, feel called to give back to the church that gave us so much. With this rich history, this beautiful legacy, I must ask myself, what if my great-grandparents hadn't helped to establish Holy Name? What if my grandparents hadn't continued in the church, raising their own family to know, love, and serve God? What if my parents hadn't committed their lives to the Catholic Church? I am quite confident that I would not have chosen to serve the Catholic Church as readily, nor would my generation and our children have seen the value of Catholic education and other ministries of our wonderful parish to the extent that we do. It is not only a privilege, but a responsibility as the baptized to contribute in a way that allows future generations the opportunities to have lives as enriched, inspired, and fruitful as ours. Scott and I are committed to investing in this annual fund in hopes of strengthening the foundation that already exists at Holy Name Catholic Church so that families for the next 100 years will benefit from the ministries offered here, growing in faith and in relationship with Jesus Christ. We are just one family, one part of a much greater legacy. How will you make your mark on the Holy Name legacy for the future of our church on this earth and in heaven?